Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of Berkeley Boost. I am Adam Sterling, Assistant Dean at Berkeley Law. Today's conversation is around the great debate, ESG. We have an incredible group of experts here to discuss that with you. Before we do, for those interested in pursuing CLE credit for today's presentation, it's been approved for 1 hour of credit in California. To request credit, you can fill out the form. We'll put the URL in the chat. It's also on the screen. You can take a screenshot of the code here, and then we will email you a certificate of attendance after the webinar. As always, if you have any questions about this process, any issues, you can email us at executive@law.berkeley.edu. But the easiest thing to do is just look in the chat on Zoom to get the link to apply for MCLE credit. Today's webinar is in connection to our newest executive education course, ESG University. So whatever side you are on about ESG, you need to know about it. And this course does an incredible job helping participants navigating all different viewpoints, issues, legal, business, financial. It comes on the heels of a popular course that we've offered for a number of years now. It's brand new. It's led by our very own Anjali Patel. She is the executive director of the Berkeley Center for Law and Business. She comes from this space. She teaches it at the law school. It's really incredible. We'll put information on that new executive course. There's a track for general practitioners and a track for directors and C-suite executives that's condensed and focused. It's a community, it's a course, a really incredible product, so check that out. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's great debate, Professor Frank Partnoy. Professor, take it away.
Thank you so much, Adam and Anjali, and welcome. We're thrilled to be able to have two of the thought leaders in this space today. If you just simply put their names in on the web, you'll see a long and illustrious background, and I'll just say briefly that Suz Mac Cormac is a partner at Morrison Foerster and has been in this space talking about ESG since before ESG was really even a term, since 2001. She's part of the ALI Principles of Corporate Governance. She structured Patagonia. She's been a friend of the law school, part of our board for many years, and I've enjoyed talking to her. And we're especially thrilled to have Omeed Malik. Omeed has also been a friend of the law school for many years and has participated in our annual financial fraud program. He, among other ventures, recently founded the investment firm 1789, a fund that has been investing in an ecosystem that he really created as a thought leader, the EIG ecosystem, which we'll hear a lot about from him. He's been involved as a thought leader in this space almost as long as Suz. I think no one has been as long as Suz. But I'm particularly interested, not only because we have this opportunity to hear from two thought leaders, and as our dean says, Berkeley is a place where all ideas and views can be expressed, and we're going to do some of that. But I'm also going to get a lot of practical knowledge here. I teach this stuff. I have a casebook that addresses many of these issues, and so I'm excited. So thank you both. First of all, thank you to all of you who are online watching this. And so I think what I'd like to do is just start with some framing in terms of both vocabulary and history, so that we're clear about what we're talking about. I think often in this debate people are not clear, and since we have two people who are so smart and in the area, let's start with some definitions and some history. And so Suz, I'll just ask you to take us back in time to 2004, since you were part of the group that came up with this term and the UN committee that coined the phrase. And give us a little bit of historical background, and then we'll open it up to Omeed to talk about some of his recent thinking in the area and how definitions are expanding. But Suz, it's your floor to tell us a little bit of a history lesson.
Well, I'll actually take you a little before 2004. And Frank, I think you know this, but I've been teaching on this at Berkeley now for 13 years. It used to be just sort of general, and now it is climate governance. So the term was actually first used in a UN report that was drafted by a bunch of institutional investors in 2004. And the report is called "Who Cares Wins." So before ESG, there was this vague sense for a lot of companies starting, even a century ago that, hey, we might want to think about our community as we operate. And as there's a separation between investors and board and management, there are things we can do. Hey, maybe we need to have a little philanthropy on the side, and sort of what arose before the term ESG was CSR. And I'm going to come back to that on the company side. And on the investor side, there was a growing movement, which started with Sister Pat and kind of divestment that became double, triple, quadruple bottom line investing. You need to be looking at things other. It all culminated in a bunch of institutional investors with I think a total of $64 trillion who are like, right, and this is ironic, right, there are all of these things and like global reporting. Now we have all these people saying we've got to report on these things and do all these things, or all these things. Let's look through and have, this is the key to all the regulation around the world, single materiality screen. Let's look at these elements of all of this other stuff and determine which are material to shareholder value, because this is why it's who cares wins. It is shareholder value. So the original definition of ESG was fairly defined, and it included cybersecurity, it included privacy, it included anti-money laundering, anti-bribery, it included ethical tech, it included climate, it included diversity, not the equity and inclusion. It included a lot of things, but it was much less broad. What happened after that is it came out and then got merged into all that other stuff. So it got merged into CSR, it got merged into what was happening on the investor side. And so I think, I haven't met Omeed before, but I think, we're going to agree it became so broad and disconnected. So two things happened then after that. We had a bunch of people, I was a founding board member of SASB, who watched this major expansion and said, we need to go back to that single materiality. We need to go back and actually winnow down what companies are looking at for shareholder value. And that was SASB that became ISSB. And then that was kind of on the reporting side. But the other thing that I think we should talk about is we can talk about the causes of the ESG movement, which are varied, but many are because it's become so broad and disaggregated from shareholder value. But there's also now a lot of regulation in this space. So SEC has been slow to act, but you've got everybody from China to the EU. The interesting thing, Frank, I will say for US companies and our US audience is, things like privacy, now there is disclosure. You've got to pay attention for business purposes. Other things like, let's just say scope 3 emissions for climate. If you are in the supply chain of any company that is reporting in China, in Singapore, in the EU, you're also going to have to manage and report. So, and we can talk about the California rules. So what's happened is we went from really broad kind of, companies should do good stuff, to narrow ESG, to broadening, to now we kind of have part of this that is really regulatory compliance, FCPA, sanctions, and disclosure, some of it corporate behavior, some of it disclosure. And then we've got kind of everything else. And I think one of the things I really want to hear from Omeed, kind of how, because it's all still considered part of ESG, how we define it and how we think about it.
Right. That's a great framing. And I think just as a plug for my co-author, Elizabeth Pullman, who has a nice history that covers some of what Suz is talking about. She is one of the leading papers in this area. But if we go back to when you started teaching this course, that's about historically, Omeed, when you started thinking hard about some of these issues around kind of 2010-ish. And so go ahead and react if there's anything you agree or disagree with in Suz's description of the history, and then give us your frame in terms of how to talk about this today.
Yeah, I'll pick up on a very important phrase that I take issue with what ESG has morphed into, which is, as she said, the disaggregation, right, between shareholder value and what it's become. And the problem is that a lot of powerful people with big platforms have made that happen. And when I got most alarmed was quite recent, was in 2019, when a lobbying organization called the Business Roundtable, if you aren't familiar with them, go do a search, decided they were going to redefine the purpose of a corporation. which was no longer just about maximizing shareholder value, which today, as much as people don't want to admit it, remains good law in Delaware, that shareholder primacy, and we can have that debate, but I haven't seen that jurisprudence overturned. So if you start with that, you have a bunch of rich fat cat CEOs coming out and saying that we need to talk about stakeholder capitalism. And I find that when you look at all the other derivatives of what that means to be highly troubling. When does it end? And you start to see certain stock exchanges mandating quotas, or they wouldn't list, or certain investment banks now that won't take a company public unless they have quotas. And all of this gets put under ESG. Now, I don't think the folks that were in that meeting with you back in 2004 or 5 ever thought that it would morph into something like this. But now I start thinking that it is about shareholder destruction, and potentially in some cases, to the extent it gets totally globalized, can put the United States' well-being at risk. And this is where I get concerned, particularly when it becomes nothing more than virtue signaling. And we can get into some of the data which I've studied, which I'm sure we will in this conversation, because that's really the most important. But anecdotally, Frank, as you care about Ponzi schemes, it's something you spend a lot of time with. You know, when you start to see companies like FTX have great ESG scores by some of these third parties, but are, you know, the largest Ponzi scheme in US history, you start to wake up and take note of that. And then you have a very divided country at the same time. And I started thinking, well, what is it that I'm for? Let's forget about creating a straw man and say what sucks and being negative about things and boycotts. I don't think that's positive. This is still a market economy, and capitalism should prevail. And during COVID, we had a situation whereby federalism really came to the forefront again. You started seeing different models of governance at the state level, California and New York on one side, Florida and Texas leading the other. And what I believe will happen now is this will emerge not just from politics and culture, but also within the economy. And a lot of what you're beginning to see is companies like BlackRock and some of these asset managers that passively invested on behalf of all 50 states are now having some of those decisions be questioned for the first time at the state level along those same political lines. And what that presents then, if you also believe there's a customer there that feels disenfranchised or overlooked, are economic opportunities. And so I'm not looking to ban ESG. I think people should have every right to do what they think is in the best interest of the corporation. We'll allow lawsuits to handle that if they do deviate from their fiduciary duties, of course. But at the same time, there should be other companies that are financed away from the ESG regime that has evolved. And that's one of the things I'm doing with 1789 Capital. What we've gotten a lot of attention is something that, you know, who I'm friends with, Vivek, is doing at the public level, top down, trying to influence behavior at the asset management level. What I'm doing with 1789 Capital is different. It's from the bottom up. We're an early stage fund that finances new companies of tomorrow, free from some of the, let's call ESG mandates that we see prevailing here in the kind of blob that it's become. And so EIG stands for Entrepreneurship, Innovation, and Growth. And there are just 3 buckets to this economy as we look at it. One is what I call the replication economy. There is a monopolistic incumbent that controls a certain portion of our economy. There should be a response to that. You're seeing some examples of that now. YouTube has a competitor called Rumble. We took a company public called Public Square, which is a response to Amazon. Let's allow the capital markets to distribute capital to some of these competitors if our government is not going to enforce antitrust law. That's one aspect. The second is companies that are going to enhance American prosperity. That's primarily around defense tech, or also in a, what I think, deglobalized world is where we're moving, that is more acrimony with us in China, is not being reliant on them for rare earth minerals, manufacturing. How are we going to onshore that to enhance American prosperity and security? And then the final bucket, where probably we're very against ESG, is an arbitrage opportunity I see, where ESG certainly has mandates that have really trickled down now. There are companies in the fossil fuel space, guns and ammunition, that have very compelling financial profiles, but are unable to even get loans from banks because of ESG policies. That's an area where we can, for cents on the dollar, invest in companies that are quite attractive because there's really no competition. So those are kind of the three buckets of EIG. We're going to be very opportunistic. The same way I think that many of these ESG funds were when I really started first hearing about it, Frank, which was in 2010, which it's no coincidence happened right after the financial crisis, and marketers were looking for a bright, shiny new toy to market. And it also took place, not coincidentally, during a zero interest rate environment when money was free. So there's no surprise also that the backlash is happening now that we have inflation, and it's not easy anymore. It's hard. And so you're going to have more of an emphasis on shareholder value in tough times. So that's really a framing of how I look at it. And I guess we can get into some of the details.
Yeah, Frank, if this is going to be a bit debate, do you want to say anything, or can I respond to a couple things that Omeed said?
No, I'd like you to respond. My job here, I'm from Kansas. I view this as this is like a rodeo, like an intellectual rodeo. And right now it's been set and the bull's out. I'm just going to try to stay on as long as I can. So you two go interrupt each other and I will try to guide you a little bit, but please react to what Omeed just said.
Good. So I want to tease out three things that Omeed said, and I didn't hear him disagreeing with me. I mean, I heard us probably having agreement that it became really, really broad. And that at a certain time in history, because of zero interest rates, you had everybody going around and marketing and greenwashing, which didn't help anybody. I want to come back to the U.S. economy piece, and that is because recent data shows that most of the amplification of the U.S. companies being woke and the anti-woke movement are actually coming from China and Russia. And in fact, China, and I was on a Zoom with some folks over there affiliated with the government, would be thrilled for U.S. to move in an anti-China direction so that they can dominate financially, not for any other reason. But at any rate, let's just tease out two other points, Omeed, that you made. First, and I want to go back to this for all the lawyers on the call, this single versus double materiality, because I've been talking about it for 25 years and people roll their eyes, but it helps explain exactly what you said, and it also helps explain the regulatory framework around the world. Single materiality, shareholder value. You know, the initial report was these are all things that matter to shareholder value, financial value, that are not on the balance sheet. That was the original thesis, right? Double materiality is, you know, things that impact the company, its business and operations, but really are focused on impact on stakeholders, not shareholders. And if you think about, I wish we had a whiteboard, 3 concentric circles. There's a whole bunch of stuff that is in the middle. You know, climate risk, doing an analysis of whether your manufacturing site is going to be underwater before you enter into a 20-year contract. It's just business risk. Like there is stuff that is in the middle. And then there is stuff, and I think the question is, on the double materiality that's not related to, or arguably in the short to medium term, not related to shareholder value, if that is promoted, you and your fund are going to say, bad thing. People like me think if you tease out elements of it, like, you know, if you're not focused on responsible tech and you're building an AI company, you may end up at a certain period of time falling on the wrong side of legislation, on the wrong side of Congress, and on the wrong side of the consumers who are buying your product. So again, related directly to your bottom line. So that's number one. The number two is all the work that is being done around shareholder primacy. And that again, if we go to single materiality, what do we mean by shareholder primacy? A lot of this is, you know, short, medium versus long term. Let's just take climate and fossil fuel. I mean, we're not going to hit 1.5 degrees. We are warming at an alarming rate. And I know people debate it, but we're going to see in our lifetime, Omeed, you and I are a similar generation. We're going to see mass migration of the type we haven't seen since the Black Plague. Just read Scientific American. A bunch of people don't care about politics. And by the way, I'm a registered Republican. So like, you know, some of this shit is just happening. We can debate, you know, whether, you know, why it's happening and how it's happening. But the question back to the shareholder primacy is, you know, what time period are you looking? Bob Litterman, whose article in the National Review was like, you know, we're headed for a cliff, and around climate and some of these other elements, you know, we just don't know when it's going to hit. So we've got to bake it into our financial models so that we can remain dominant and compete with Russia and China. It's not so that we can all wring our hands and wear our Birkenstocks and feel good about hanging out in Berkeley. Sorry.
So can I get both of you just to talk a little bit more precisely about what you mean when you're talking about shareholders and shareholder value? And there are two different ways that we can think about this. One is that the difference between the two of you is how you would interpret what is long-term shareholder value is kind of category one. Category two is that you might disagree about what the goal of the corporation is. So under Delaware law, we talk about the corporation and its shareholders. And there's a distinction between the corporation, which might be more capacious. And my understanding, I won't put words in either of your mouths, but Suz might say the corporation is big enough to capture stakeholders. And so we're talking about two different things when we're talking about the corporation and its shareholders. And Omeed would say, no, when we're talking about the corporation, we're really talking about shareholders. So can you both just imagine that you're in my class now and you're talking to law students and tell us in these two areas, long-term and this concept that involves the corporation and its shareholders, how you think about both of those two things.
Omeed, I'll let you go first because I just ranted.
No problem. So I try to, when I was thinking about this, is like, what would be the North Star? What does it look like if, let's say, the real, and I'm not putting anybody in this category, like if the utopia of ESG took form, like what would those companies look like? And I think we have a framework, which are these public benefit corporations, which is, I think, the codification or legalization of some of this, where you define a mission. And my understanding of researching them is that they effectively are providing a little bit of a liability shield outside of what you would get just on the business judgment rule, based on the jurisprudence we keep referring in Delaware, where most of the American corporations have been incorporated. So public benefit corporation, I think there's about maybe 20 of them. And so what you could do, and what we did do, was find them just based on their Edgar codes and plot them out and see from when they either went public or when they converted to that status, how they did. So if you just passively invested in the S&P over the past decade or two, you get about an 8% return. And if you look at these companies that obviously have other things in their mind, called it stakeholder or whatever term of art you want to use, the median performance of these companies is down 60% since they did that. So to me, that suggests that when you take your eye off the ball, there are consequences. Now, again, I want to be very clear. I'm not calling for the evisceration of this or banning any of it. I'm simply suggesting that there need to be alternatives, and that we should not, from a regulatory perspective, mandate that all companies go down this road. And I'm not sure anyone on this call is either, but there are people I've dealt with that want the SEC pushing all of this stakeholder stuff and making sure that companies must abide by it. Most notably, some of the equity and inclusion aspects that I think are destructive to shareholder value, and would see that. So again, data, we plotted it all out. We are happy to provide this to the group afterwards, our work to show this horrible level of performance, and then people will just make their own decisions, I suppose.
Omeed, let's go back to the shareholder, the long-term value, because I have to respond to this.
Yeah.
Because I worked with two of the largest banks who did a similar analysis. So I also love data. And first of all, there were 23. Now there are 22 publicly traded PBCs, public benefit corporations. To answer Frank's question, and I think, Omeed, you and I would agree, the difference is may versus shall. I believe a company could consider stakeholders, but it may affect their shareholder value. I mean, it's the same, you can, you pay your CEO 100 times the market rate. You may be sued for totally, it's may versus shall. And you're right that the public benefit, not a B Corp, not the benefit corporation in states like New York, the only publicly traded are these 22 PBCs. They divide into two categories. So first of all, I actually go back to your argument that there was this whole movement, zero interest rates, free money, and you had everybody running around Wall Street selling ESG, not really knowing what it is. Totally agree with you there. These companies a few of them through the de-SPAC process went public at that time. And so they went public and they were trying to market to the world, hey, we are good. We are good. We're having a positive impact. About half of them should never have gone public to begin with. They did not have good and strong internal, internal governance, internal policies, great revenue. They were the latest EV company because everybody liked EVs, but that's more the fault, quite bluntly, of the investors. It's not something that is wrong with the form. And when the two banks that I work with did a really deep dive in their data and looked at them, they divided into those two categories. Those companies that should have gone, that could have gone, if you took the PBC out, could have had everything that a banker or you would say could go public, they were equal to the 8%. If you take the other companies, they're doing much, much worse. They are like, but it is factors other than the PBC. So I really don't agree. And to answer Frank's question, then we should go back to the shareholder value. For me, a corporation can consider stakeholders, and there may be good reasons to consider stakeholders because those stakeholders are the customers, those stakeholders, the communities in which they operate. There may be good shareholder value reasons. I think it's becoming a bit mooted. If I can go to the regulatory, you now have an incredibly deep regulatory regime in the EU with CSRD that is double materiality. They're requiring you to consider stakeholders in addition to shareholders. And so you're like, okay, I don't really care. I'm a small gun manufacturer in Fremont, whatever. If you're selling to anybody that is in Europe, you've got to get the data and you've got to report to them, even if you don't have to report here. And so some of it is becoming mooted. I worry the same as you, that's going to impact profitability and impact financial viability. 100% agree. But I just wanted to provide some additional data. Then do we want to go back to the first question, or do you want to respond to that and then we can go back to the first question on what we mean by shareholder value?
Look, lies, damn lies, and statistics. So I understand. But you'd have to admit, like, I can only do what I can do as it relates to taking these guys that are saying we are this thing and beating their chest and looking at how they performed. And
9 of the top AI companies are forming. Yeah. Elon Musk's new AI company is a PBC. I was a drafter of the original of these corporate forums. So I wanted it all to be positive. I agree with you, it's not all positive, but you have to look at the factors that are leading to the performance and determine whether it is whether it is the PB or the public benefit or whether it is other factors.
Right, but then on your side, then at best, it's being manipulated by people who are just not ready for prime time and saying, I'm using this as a marketing scheme.
100%.
That's what they did. So why is Allbirds in that category? What is their mission, right? I mean, it's like, it should never have done that. I mean, I look at the list and these are not our greatest companies. My sense is that then this is a form or a derivative of greenwashing where they're exploiting something in order to basically manipulate and pull on the heartstrings of people that are fundamentally good. And so I don't know necessarily what the answer is. Let's maybe say it's slightly nascent in this particular cohort that we've identified, and we'll give it more time. But it certainly is an alarming data point if you just look at all of them, and perhaps it had something to do with the de-SPAC area. That's an area I'm very familiar with. We do a lot of SPACs. And it is a hard thing, especially when it goes from the go-go days to now around interest rates and all the SPAC taxes that have occurred from a regulatory perspective. So I certainly have empathy for that position, but I wanted to bring it up. And again, I mean, you can continue to go and see that so much of this, and this is maybe more of this is just my personal opinion, I think the kind of high watermark of the absurdity was the Business Roundtable, which again is like a business lobbying organization trying to come out and virtue signal in 2019 really is the tipping point. But businesses are savvy. I mean, to me, you look at Occupy Wall Street after the financial crisis and the anger towards this cohort. And now all of a sudden, these corporations have decided to embrace all of these other things that have nothing to do with making money in a way to stave off effectively the reckoning. The problem for them now, and for people who have gone all the way into this water, is the reckoning is coming. I mean, you see, even just on a political basis, where I see this playing out is a bifurcated economy in the United States. Forget about my first point, which is deglobalization. That's absolutely happening. And I think the area that I would suggest to you is that one of the biggest proponents of ESG would, of course, be China. They want us moving to electric vehicles because they control the lithium market. I think there are national security concerns about a global ESG perspective. China and India are the world's biggest polluters. And so we cannot sacrifice our own competitiveness against them on the basis of something that we think, because we're going to, it's basically creates a free rider effect. And that's what I see happening globally right now.
100%.
So this is like where we get, and it's very hard to separate the politics from this, because what this debate will necessarily include is the law, regulation, but mostly the people, the politics that we're going to see here is that every red state, I just met with the governor of Florida before this call, we are going to be pushing back majorly on this now. And so you're going to create basically the same way you're seeing there's this different regimes between Europe and the United States, you're going to have different regimes within the United States itself now around this topic. That's how visceral it is. Red states will refuse to invest their pensions, not only in large asset managers, but frankly, any hedge fund that has an ESG policy. That's where we're headed in the next 2 years. We're at the first stages of that, but I know what's happening and where it's going. And maybe that's not the worst thing, because we need a little bit of competition. And then ultimately, I'd like to see which method or which approach wins. And we need that healthy level of competition here, and let the best approach win.
And we do. It goes back to what we said initially. I mean, the problem is the definition of ESG. There is not an asset manager in this country that doesn't consider, when they're investing in tech, privacy and cybersecurity, not one. Totally. And that's part of ESG. So I think what's going to happen on ESG, and then we're going to go back to shareholder value, is it's going to be broken apart. And I agree with you. Most of the ESG, most of the lawyers advising these PE funds, they put a policy together, they put it on the shelf, they market it. They're not actually doing it. We need to drill down, because each one of them is different. And what's interesting to me, I am actually born and raised in a red state, is DE&I is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And to me, the two huge issues in this country and around the globe are inequality and, you know, the separation, which you're seeing politically, you're seeing other ways, and then climate. But so my first point is, every asset manager is going to focus on ESG. They're just going to call it something different, right? I mean, BlackRock
dropped it, right? Coca-Cola dropped the phrase entirely, and now
but they're still focusing on. I represent some of these folks, and they're still focusing. You know, I represent somebody who has a climate mandate through their investment asset manager. They're still taking money from, you know, the Florida pension fund, because they're not looking at ESG. They're measuring it in risk, and they're getting fabulous returns. And so despite the so it's, I don't want you to say, you know, let's see who wins between ESG and anti-ESG. That's like, you know, I mean, that's a false dichotomy, right? So
but it only becomes false if you do the first step, which is not incumbent on my side. It's incumbent on that side. I'm not even putting you in it. It's, you need to stop the BS and start defining it in things that actually have some tie to shareholder value, which is what you're saying.
I agree. And you have to measure for the money that you are putting into it. So there are a couple things like the data convergence project that CalSTRS and Carlyle started, right? That most in the private markets, most of your asset managers are now putting your data in. So let's just say you care about decarbonization. One of the issues I've had is you're investing in solar. You have no idea for the money, you know, whether that's actually reducing emissions or not, and whether they're doing it efficiently, and whether they're using all of that kind of stuff. Having the ability to have all of the information from all of the investors in this area is a really good thing. But let's just go back to shareholder value, and let me push on one.
Before I want to get to that, I want you to have plenty of time to talk about shareholder value, but I just want you to know that while you've been talking, there's been an explosion of questions and commentary, and I just want you to reflect on one aspect of it, which I think is central to the polarized aspects of the debate you're discussing right now, and then we'll get to shareholder value. So just like you to say a little bit to the people both watching right now and in the world who hear what you're saying and put it in one of two buckets. Either it's virtue signaling and it's not about value, or it's about real value. It's about creating value for stakeholders and shareholders. How do you respond to people who have that kind of visceral reaction, even to the astute, balanced conversation the two of you are having right now? How should we as a society deal with the fact that people are instinctively reacting in a polarized way, hearing what you're saying as either virtue signaling or creating actual value?
Well, I mean,
I think, I think if I can, again, I wish I had a whiteboard. You have 3 concentric circles. There are some, and I think even Omeed would agree with me, there are some elements of ESG that are material to pure financial value or their compliance. You know, I mean, let's just take FCPA, anti-money laundering, anti-bribery, you know, and you get a huge claim and, you know, or cybersecurity and somebody, you know, hacks in and breaches financial. So there is stuff that's purely financial. There's stuff where there is an overlap. And then there is elements of, when I say stuff, elements of ESG that are more virtue signaling. And I think we need to, I think Omeed and I would agree, instead of just using the, let me just say, for when I'm working with companies and even investors, why I like to still use the term ESG is because purely from a regulatory perspective, compliance, all of the laws in this area are extraterritorial. So, Omeed, we can debate whether or not there should be a global ESG, whatever. The rules, scope 3 emissions, cybersecurity, you are, you know, human rights, you are responsible for yourself and everybody that is in your value chain, all of your counterparties. And so because of that, you have to, some of these you have to consider just because there is regulation. If you blow the regulation, you're going to pay fines. Whether that's good or bad, we can debate how competent the government or how competent the EU is in passing the rules and whether that's actually going to have a positive effect. That's a separate argument. But I would say, Frank, you know, I think we should just call a spade and break ESG apart. I like ESG because as a company, if you're dealing with one supplier in Micronesia and you have 6 different people from the company, one person asking them about human rights, one person asking them about cyber, one person asking them about climate, I mean, like you get all of these different answers and it's jumbled. And I've actually had a client who said, you know, same supplier, Micronesia, hey, you get an F on your cybersecurity, we're firing you. At the same time, somebody else in the organization said, you get an A on human rights, where you're renewing your contract for 20 years, and nobody was evaluating the climate risk, the fact that the supplier was going to be underwater. So there needs to be some, when it is not specifically on the balance sheet, you need some way of measuring that. Omeed would say you need to measure it to make sure, to see whether it has an impact on, and maybe in fact, you shouldn't be investing. You shouldn't be spending more in your supply chain to make sure that your threads have been, dyed by the appropriate, I don't know, you get where I'm going. You get why I'm making that analogy in terms of shoes, but I'll stop there.
What's encouraging is that this debate is taking place, this conversation is taking place. It's hosted by Berkeley, not the University of Chicago. So that's obviously very encouraging that, someone superficially with my perspective on the topic was invited to talk about it by Berkeley. That's saying a lot. And Berkeley has an ESG school I saw at the outset. Okay, maybe one day it'll have an EIG school and I can be the dean of it. But my point is that you have to have more conversations like this where you end up finding out that we probably agree on like 70% of what's happened here. And I think everyone understands that this has gotten too big, it's nebulous, and the more nebulous it gets, the more harm it's doing because it's not popular. And if you make it to mean everything, it means nothing. And that's, I think, where we're headed. And these are the kinds of conversations that be taking place. Ultimately, what I see is what I think Suz rightfully pointed out from my perspective is that the Chancery Court in Delaware is going to get busy. You're going to see lawsuits, and we're going to see whether the business judgment rule, how far that's going to go in certain cases. There is litigation against Target for what they did with, people saying transgender bathing suits for 2-year-olds and the market cap evisceration that occurred with them or Disney for some of the stuff that they were doing. These things that maybe some of the original practitioners of ESG would say, that has nothing to do with ESG. But for me, when I think about ESG, I never consider that someone would think that AML or Foreign Corrupt Practices Act would be part of ESG. But I'm totally in favor of that, obviously. You know, I'm someone that's run several public companies, being compliant with Sarbanes-Oxley. That's the thing, like, how broad is this going to be? And if it's broad with the good stuff that actually does deliver shareholder value and prevent fraud, then everybody should be in favor of that. But if it's getting into stuff that's actually going to harm the corporation, you start having disclosures in SEC documents where you're seeing that the CEOs are enriching themselves based on how many diverse hires they made, but their shares are in the tank. Well, that's a misalignment of interest, and someone better file a lawsuit against them.
Yeah, and I don't disagree. I mean, what we're both saying, I think, Frank, is like, it's just, it's exactly where, Omeed, you started this conversation. The terminology matters. And we've gotten to a world where this area is being hyper politicized by everyone on both sides. I mean, you know, to attack and to forward an agenda. And I watch it and I just sit here and I decry. But where we disagree, let's go back to single and double materiality and shareholder value. And I think you and I disagree on DEI too, because I'll just say all of the data I've seen is diversity in a workforce and in decision making actually yields higher shareholder value. But we can debate that later. Back to the shareholder value point. If I go above you, well, I want to get to equality too, but if I go above you to the asset owners, and let's just say I am responsible for all of the retirement funds for the teachers of California. Let's just say one day I woke up and that was given to me. I'm just a corporate lawyer, but I believe that the data shows that my returns, teachers are so underpaid to begin with, right? Like I have got to drive for returns there so that they have some money to retire. They have some money to be able to, you know, maybe send their kids to college if they're doing that. So at any rate, we'll focus on the retirement. My returns are based more on the GDP of countries like the United States than they are on the individual alpha of any individual company. And this is where I get to the shareholder value point. We have never in our economic history had something like climate change and inequality, but climate change, which breaks all of the rules, affects everything. It is the source of migration. It is the source of, and yeah, we need a good immigration policy. It is a primary source of civil unrest. Why do you think Iran is weighing into Gaza? For 5 years, Scientific American has been saying Iran is going to be running out of arable land within 5 years. Like, you know, when people don't have enough arable land, can't feed themselves, civil unrest, migration, pressure on our borders, which has just started. All of that. And then if you look at the returns, let's go back to the pension fund for the teachers. I have got to make sure this is the tragedy of the commons. I've got to make sure that every company individually will have higher alpha if they ignore this, but they're all going to lose. Everybody is going to lose. And the teachers particularly are going to lose if we all ignore it. I don't think we can rely on our government to set policy. This is why we need to drive for some scaffolding. I mean, this was the original, before it got politicized, the original PBC was intended to do exactly what you said, which is let's provide protection if Chevron wants to engage more quickly in energy transition. And in the short term, the share price drops. So long term, they can be more profitable because they have trillions of dollars of stranded assets and they're going to have to shift away. That was a long ramble on shareholder value.
The one of the hallmarks that we all know as attorneys study this in law school is that sometimes the biggest proponents of regulation are the biggest companies. It's somewhat counterintuitive at first, but it's like you've already reached the top of the mountain. So how do I pull the ladder out from behind so no one can get there? And I see a lot of that in the ESG debate, which is, as a counter of some more unsophisticated folks. Well, Apple's really ESG compliant. Super easy to do that when you're a monopoly and worth a couple $1 trillion and you've already exploited slave labor in a different country. So I actually, don't buy that argument from the biggest. But again, we've got a real problem. I mean, if you look at our industry, and I do think we would agree that the political will has simply not been there. We have our Congress abdicating its role to administrative agencies, And that's also part of the issue. Look at some of the regulatory regimes that govern our most important sectors. The pharmaceutical industry is massively benefited by a law passed in 1986 that relates to immunity. And the internet, as we know it today, is governed by a law that was passed in 1996, when we were worried about companies like Prodigy getting off the ground. And nothing's been changed in that period of time. So there is an enormous amount of inertia really at the top, and then that goes into a whole political argument about the money that's buying off these people that are not doing anything. And so what I worry about is that you create more rules that are going to really just benefit the monopolies and innovation, because everyone has to comply with these things, which are very difficult. There need to be different regulatory regimes based on the different stages of companies, whether they're private, public, and then what their sizes are. You know, if you want to go on all these kind of vanity adventures and add all these things that you have to do, it's very different for Apple than it is for the new startup that's coming out. And we need to keep sight of that. And when you talk about the retirees' money, that's of the utmost important to me as well. And then you hear these anecdotes, like I'm sure you've seen it. The Wall Street Journal reported on this Hartford Funds in 2021 that called itself sustainable, immediately raised $100 million, then lost all their money and dropped the name. And it's like, this is the stuff that needs to be cracked down on because it serves no benefit and has just been nothing more than a marketing scheme. And as we said, put aside the state I'm in right now, Florida itself has divested over several $1 billion from BlackRock. That's the only way you change behavior, is that people got complacent. It was easy for BlackRock to slap the label on because no one was paying any attention. Now, as we all agree, sunlight's the best disinfectant, and we'll see who's actually doing any of these things.
I need to weigh into what Omeed said. Sorry, Frank.
Okay, and I'm going to try to summarize and reframe some of this, but go ahead.
Because you assumed I just went to, we need a lot of regulation. The reason we have all of this voluntary compliance as SASB and others that have become ISSB is because the government didn't act. So yeah, a bunch of industries across industries got together and said, hey, we need to figure out what this ESG thing is with the single materiality lens. And we got to make sure we have reporting so that investors have real data that they can use for purposes of an investor. Regulators have been slow and will continue to slow. I think in some things we need regulation. Here I'm going back to the combination of climate and inequality. So let's go back to the teachers in Florida, underpaid, underappreciated, really, really left behind by our economy, and they're key to our future, right? And, I'm saying it is the pension funds that ignore the terminology that should be saying, actually, when these teachers retire at 30, in the next 20 years, our returns are going to be better if every company and every asset manager and every company that they invest in focuses on reducing emissions and climate risk. We believe as a whole, and we're the ones who have to regulate. So I think it's really the purview of some of the people you're going to be working with. And I'll say the number two thing, which is going to be provocative for you, the number one cause of inequality, according to Hartford, is not CEO pay. It is actually carry. So we have fund managers who aggregate carry and invest the money for these teachers who are scraping by and then walk off and pay themselves hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. And that, to me, is key to this whole inequality debate. That's why diversity in and of itself, but I take the inequality as a separate category because it's one of the reasons we have these debates. Rural North Carolina, where I'm from, people are pissed off. They're pissed off at people in San Francisco. They're pissed off at people in New York. Quite frankly, they're pissed off at people in Florida because they have been completely left behind economically, politically, religiously, and in every other way. And and they're scared for good reason about what's happening around them. And so we've got to somehow, and government has abdicated its responsibility. And that's why it's a good business imperative for companies to be weighing in and for the asset owners to be starting to include some of the scaffolding in their mandate.
Okay, this has been fantastic, and thank you both for engaging with each other on these issues. And I just want to try to take a step back and say that what I'm hearing from both of you are areas of agreement and areas of disagreement that I want you to be a little bit more precise about. So just using Suz's categories, if you both agree that things are good for shareholders, and the various examples that you've given, you will both advocate for the same position. That one seems, category 1 seems relatively straightforward to me. Category 3 seems relatively straightforward, at least for understanding the areas of disagreement, because you might disagree about whether what a corporation is doing is actually creating some kind of a benefit for stakeholders that it's entitled to do under law. But the really hard category for me to understand, and where I think you're talking past each other a little bit, and I'd like you to just engage with, is how we parse out in category 2 when something is redistributive versus not. So a lot of the disagreement that I'm hearing from the two of you is about two kind of fundamental economic factors that aren't necessarily captured by law. To some extent they are. One is, to what extent are we going to allow corporations to externalize costs onto others? So to what extent are we going to say maximizing shareholder value is something that we should do, but we've got externalized costs, and if we as a society could get together, then we would have corporations be doing something different. And philosophically, I'm hearing disagreement that comes out of your regulatory approaches or the way you think about individual cases. But I'd like you to just think about, okay, how should we think about ESG and externalities as a concept? And then second, how should we think about ESG and redistribution? You just started down this topic of thinking about economic inequality. Part of the problem here, I think, is once we start measuring ESG or sustainability or any of these other factors, we create uncertainty. So I write in this area, my colleague Adam Badawi and I write in this area, many academics try to decompose ESG into risk factors to come up with a number that's ESG, and then look at whether it's correlated in any meaningful way with other factors. So for example, we found that one ESG metric is correlated with securities litigation, which very much fits into your talking about regulation. But is this a mistake to even try? I mean, I'd like to hear you just talk a little bit about whether trying to quantify some of these concepts creates more problems than it's worth, and that people will basically weaponize a result from the quantification to try to argue for their position on redistribution. So can you just, we don't have a ton of time left, but could you just frame the areas of disagreement in terms of externalities and redistribution? Because in my world, the academic world, this is the way that we think about a lot of this is, how should we optimally be internalizing some of these costs, or how much redistribution should we be doing? And you're looking at me kind of puzzled, and now I'm wondering if I've asked the wrong question. But can you use those terms at least? Can you use those terms as through your areas of disagreement? Because I think there's a fundamental disagreement between the two of you, but I'm trying to crystallize exactly what it's sourced from. It's all, to me, in category 2, but if you can at least use those terms, talk about externalities, and you started talking about redistribution in framing.
Sort of redistribution. Let me actually talk about, you talked about a bunch of different things. One is, I think you were saying, and Omeed was hitting on this, should we be measuring it? I won't, and Omeed had mentioned earlier, and I didn't respond to, you look at how these companies are ranked on ESG. Ranking of companies on ESG just is a fool's errand right now, right? Because you have companies that are ranked really highly that are awful. It all depends. I think you have to distinguish between these factors, which are key and material internal to operations. This is the difference between the PBCs that are successful and those that are not. Those that have good fundamentals in terms of how they are operating that are reflected on their balance sheet. And some of them are
numbers that people who are watching, are there numbers that people should look at that you would find credible, or would you say, no, just don't look at ESG related metrics? I think it is getting better, but I think Omeed and I would probably agree. A lot of the proponents of those measurements are imposing a value screen on it, and so you end up with, because they want a certain outcome. But so that's me
too, by the way. Like I get, this is the thing. We keep agreeing on it. She's attacking the existing framework that it's become as much as I am. Every time I say something, she's like, yeah, that's BS. This is so.
Let me get to where I think that. Yeah. So I wanted to take that off the table because I think you and I agree, and I just wanted to counter ratings or not. not really what it is. If we take the externality and redistribution, I'll take the second one first, the redistribution. When I'm talking about redistribution and I'm talking about carry, our government has made a decision that profits associated with investment should be redistributed from the workers who are making, and some people like KKR with their worker ownership and are trying to address it, but it should be redistributed from the creators of value to the investors in the form of carry. To me, that is a redistribution that I'd love Omeed to respond to. When I'm talking about
does EIG, just before you get to the second one, does EIG take into account this kind of redistribution? Or how will EIG, if we adopt EIG, how will we think about redistribution?
Well, yeah, I mean, if as it relates specifically to the example of carry.
Sure, or more generally, but sure, on carry.
But if you're talking about carry, to me, that is an issue that has been with us for a long time, particularly when Buffett and Obama made it an issue and did absolutely nothing about it when they had control of the Congress for at least 2 years when Obama originally won. And that's because, by and large, the Democratic Party is funded by these guys, so they're not going to do anything about it. That said, it's, again, like anything else, my solution is, ultimately, if you have underperformance and more choice and different answers, carry is going to get renegotiated down. It already is. And on behalf of the pensions, I agree, it's extremely expensive. That behooves the state treasurers of those fiduciaries to start doing something about it. And a lot of them, like CalPERS, are, by the way, and very vocal. That's the power of their purse. Now, from now on, we're never paying that. We're not paying that management fee. We're going to stop, or you lose our assets. They've done it in other topics. You kind of wonder, why aren't they saying it about that one? I'm against crony capitalism in all forms. I'm against our welfare. 10% of all welfare that's paid out, 10% of it goes to soda companies. Okay? I'm against that. I'm against Walmart having a large percentage of their population on welfare and having us pay for that. So I'm against all of that stuff. Is that redistribution?
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm just like, when I don't know that there'd be any disagreement on that topic at all.
Well, let me go to where I think there is disagreement, and then you can respond. So when I'm talking about the teachers in Florida, I'm also not talking about redistribution. It really goes to the externality. And I would posit that the teachers will be better off if somebody, and I think it should be the asset owners, it could be the regulators, say, you must, every asset manager must consider climate, emissions, and risk in every investment, even if it affects the individual alpha, because long-term, if friggin' half of Florida is underwater and these companies are no longer existing, if between 80 and 90% of low-income housing in Florida is not climate resilient, you guys are going to get creamed. Like, purely economically, let's focus on the economics of America and address it. And no individual company wants to address it because it doesn't help their profitability. But if all of them are required to, all of them will get better. And that to me is the fundamental. These are the externalities that companies have been pushing off. Government hasn't picked up. We've tried to have these collaborations where people, and maybe we're driving it with disclosure. I'm not sure that's the answer either. But Omeed?
Yeah, so that's where we obviously, I do think, have disagreement, and I think you picked up on that. That's not an area where I'm comfortable looking out and having some sort of regulation enforce that. But again, that's an area that we haven't got into, and I don't think is really worth, because we would have to have a climate debate, first of all, to accept the premise she's asserting, which she thinks is established science. And let me not even go there for a moment. I don't even want to attack that presupposition. I can go and look at it from a national security standpoint, which I started to do earlier. I'm extremely concerned about these treaties that the United States is spearheading when our biggest geopolitical foes have no interest whatsoever in stopping any of their development and usage of fossil fuels. So we may be underwater. We may be under the thumb of the CCP if we don't get smarter soon. They have ambitions to take this country over. That may not be a popular viewpoint with this audience, but it's something I feel very strongly about. And I am very concerned about China's ascension and for the last 24 years, support of that Frankenstein across the board, again, at the detriment of the working and middle class in this country, which is to make this country nothing more than a customer. and make everything over there, which is part of the issue that I have with a lot of the decisions that our corporations have made. We don't make anything. If you do not have any power over your own supply chain, you have no national sovereignty. And that's something that I think about a lot as it relates to climate, because these are global agreements. The climate is a global issue. And yet, again, like I say, the worst actors don't have any intention of abiding by it. And that's where I feel like that's problematic. And then particularly when some of the most vocal oligarchs in our country that make all these statements and then go move to the beautiful coastline of Florida in their new homes and continue to fly around in their private jets and then lecture the middle class that are the ones that are most harmed by some of these policies. That's a hypocrisy that, again, does not address whether what you're saying over the next 10 or 20 years is true or not, but is very difficult politically to stomach. And I think that's going to be a source of contention in this debate. And we'll just have to figure out a way through it, I suppose.
Working together.
Yeah, working together. And again, I think I would just close by saying that ultimately, I think a lot of what was the primary debate in today's call, which was that relationship or disaggregation of shareholder value to stakeholder considerations. That's the legal issue in front of us. That's the one that we're going to see solved by litigation. And ultimately, that redefinition or clarification of fiduciary duty is going to inform how these corporations act in the future. And my small job in all this is to provide choice away from what I see the prevailing paradigm to be. That's it.
Suz, do you have a final word? And then I'll close.
We need to save the world.
That's well put. I just want to thank both of you so much for being willing to have this debate. I think our country is so much better off when we come together and have these kinds of discussions and figure out what our areas of overlap are and what our areas of disagreement are. And ESG is one of these areas that tends to be very polarizing. And I think both of you have added to our knowledge in incremental and important ways. So I just want to thank you for being willing to do this. And I did a great service by introducing the two of you to each other. And so did Adam Sterling. And we hope that relationship will continue, and we're expecting great wisdom from both of you in the future. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this. And I thought it was fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frank.
Yes.
Thank you
I fell off the horse about 45 minutes ago, but it was great fun trying.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone, and thanks all of you that joined today. A reminder, check out our ESG University course, which covers these issues deeply, and we've already agreed offline that this debate will become a mandatory viewing for that program. So thank you, everyone, for your time. Thank you, Anjali, for leading this effort here at Berkeley, and we'll see you all on the next Berkeley Boost.